Well, good evening, and thank you all for being here for the closing session in the Strand Insurgent Cosmopolitanisms. And thank you for the great energy and commitment. It is quite late in the evening, so it's great that we can convene again like this. Also, this session comes within the Strand right after the extraordinary meditation of Homi Bhabha, which cut two ways in time, in temporality and textuality. If on the one hand it reread against the canonical grain a major text and by Kant and brought that to life in a very different worldscape, if you will, of experiences, he also looked forward to a stake in the contemporary by the artist Zarina Hashmi, grounding his meditations on encounter, mobility, communication, and production, really the production of art, not only on notions of identity, but also anchoring them very strongly in questions of practice and the experience of actually committing yourself to and working out a poetics. So it's that notion of cosmopolitanism not as inherited or received idea, but cosmopolitanism as cultural labor that we've tried to, if you will, elaborate and speak around and discuss through this strand. So I want to bring that meditation on the exilic and the diasporic experience, which so crucially informs our global contemporary, to bear on the thoughts, insights, and practices of two artists, Allan deSouza, who's here, and Praneet Soi. And I want also to focus in their work on, at one level, the experiences of the post-colonial and the immigrant subjectivity. But I also want us to maybe focus as we go along on these not as sealed, identity-oriented questions, but to see how, in fact, these preoccupations play out through translocal, transverse, zigzag practices, through an encounter with diverse materials, diverse economies of production, diverse interlocutors and collaborators, and also, of course, a certain diversity of location. And again, as I said, this forms a very interesting segue from what Homi had to say earlier. So I'm just going to frame very briefly, and as well biographically, each artist, because Allan's family history connects him to India, but also to Kenya, the UK, and the US. So all of these have been grounds for a certain formation of a particular cultural subjectivity, but also, and Portugal. We extend even further, not merely to create an itinerary of ancestral journeys, but also to point to specific political questions in each of those locations. And similarly, various decisions and circumstances relate Praneet here to Calcutta, but also to Amsterdam, where he lives and works, and to Buenos Aires and to Mexico City. Once again, not listed as an itinerary, but merely to point out that these are the very diverse settings where his particular negotiations with different economies of production and different political questions take place. And just before I invite Allan to present a work that speaks to the heart of these concerns, I just want to say that in some sense our discussion here is dedicated to Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian novelist, truly one of the great figures of contemporary world literature who passed away. And I'm thinking here of something Achebe wrote a long time ago about his experiences as a child brought up in a British colonial system and reading the works of Joseph Conrad. And he talks of how, as a child, he identified immediately, as it were, through pedagogical assimilation with Marlowe and with the various other, for lack of another description, white or European protagonists. And that was only much later that it occurred to him as an adolescent that his identification was probably mistaken. In fact, it was certainly mistaken, because in the text, in the narrative, his position was that occupied by, as he puts it, the strange people making funny faces on the shore while Marlowe's boat passed. And that moment of cognitive dissonance is repeated or recursed or revisited in diverse ways for the post-colonial subjectivity. So I just want us to hold that thought in mind, as well as the suggestions that we glean from, say, the writings of the Philippine nationalist and novelist Jose Rizal, from whom Anderson derives his magical title, The Spectre of Comparisons. That if you're a post-colonial subject, a subjectivity, you're always in several places at the same time. You are in the locus that you inhabit, but you're also in loci of comparison, reference, analogy, inheritance, which are very far away. And you're constantly negotiating among these. I'm thinking here also of Paul Gilroy's amazing trope of the double consciousness, that, again, is a constitutive part of this particular kind of subjectivity. So having put these suggestions in place, I'm now going to, speaking of Conrad, I'm going to invite you, Allan, to go directly into the heart of darkness.
Okay. I'm going to actually quote, as a beginning, I'm going to quote from Chinua Achebe's. As a beginning, I'm going to quote from Chinua Achebe's. As a glorious essay, I'm going to quote from Chinua Achebe's. As a glorious essay, I'm going to quote from Chinua Achebe. Is it not coming through at all? Oh, it is. Yep, try. Right. Let me start again. Okay. Quoting from Chinua Achebe. I am talking about a book which parades in the most vulgar fashion prejudices and insults from which a section of humankind, sorry, he writes mankind, has suffered untold agonies and atrocities in the past and continues to do so in many ways and many places today. Conrad did not originate the image of Africa, which we find in his book. It was and is the dominant image of Africa in the Western imagination, and Conrad merely brought the peculiar gifts of his own mind to bear on it. Africa is to Europe as the pitcher is to Dorian Gray, a carrier onto whom the master unloads his physical and moral deformities, so that he may go forward, erect and immaculate. So keep in mind the picture of Dorian Gray, and I'm going to lead into a project that I've been working on is a rewriting of The Heart of Darkness in a form that rhymes with the original. So I'm changing every word to a rhyming word from to the original text. And the video I'm going to play you is just, it's not the work itself, it's produced for tonight, just to give you an idea of the process of making. Okay, so the text you're going to read is the text that I've rewritten, and the text you'll hear is me reading from the original text.
The Nelly, a cruising yawl, swung to her anchor without a flutter of the sails, and was at rest. The flood had made, the wind was nearly calm, and being bound down the river, the only thing for it was to come to and wait for the turn of the tide. The sea reach of the Thames stretched before us like the beginning of an interminable waterway. In the offing, the sea and the sky were welded together without a joint, and in the luminous space, the tanned sails of the barges, drifting up with the tide, seemed to stand still in red clusters of canvas sharply peaked, with gleams of varnished sprits. A haze rested on the low shores that ran out to sea in vanishing flatness. The air was dark above Gravesend, and farther back still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionless over the biggest and the greatest town on earth. The director of companies was our captain and our host. We four affectionately watched his back as he stood on the bows looking to seaward. On the whole river, there was nothing that looked half so nautical. He resembled a pilot, which to a seaman is trustworthiness personified. It was difficult to realize his work was not out there in the luminous estuary, but behind him, within the brooding gloom. Between us there was, as I've already said somewhere, the bond of the sea. Besides holding our hearts together through long periods of separation, it had the effect of making us tolerant of each other's yarns and even convictions. The lawyer, the best of old fellows, had, because of his many years and many virtues, the only cushion on deck, and was lying on the only rug. The accountant had brought out already a box of dominoes, and was toying architecturally with the bones. Marlowe sat cross-legged right aft, leaning against the mizzenmast. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion, a straight back, an ascetic aspect, and with his arms dropped, the palms of hands outwards, resembled an idol. The director, satisfied the anchor had good hold, made his way aft and sat down amongst us. We exchanged a few words lazily. Afterwards there was silence on board the yacht. For some reason or other, we did not begin that game of dominoes. We felt meditative and fit for nothing but placid staring. The day was ending in a serenity of still and exquisite brilliance. The water shone pacifically. The sky, without a speck, was a benign immensity of unstained light. The very mist on the Essex marshes was like a gauzy and radiant fabric, hung from the wooded rises inland, and draping the low shores in diaphanous folds. Only the gloom to the west, brooding over the upper reaches, became more sombre every minute, as if angered by the approach of the sun. And at last, in its curved and imperceptible form, the sun sank low, and from glowing white changed to a dull red, without rays and without heat, as if about to go out suddenly, stricken to death by the touch of that gloom brooding over a crowd of men. Forthwith, a change came over the waters, and the serenity became less brilliant but more profound. The old river in its broad reach rested unruffled at the decline of day, after ages of good service done to the race that peopled its banks, spread out in the tranquil dignity of a waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth. We looked at the venerable stream, not in the vivid flush of a short day that comes and departs forever, but in the august light of abiding memories. And indeed, nothing is easier for a man who has, as the phrase goes, followed the sea with reverence and affection, than to evoke the great spirit of the past upon the lower reaches of the Thames. The tidal current runs to and fro in its unceasing service, crowded with memories of men and ships it had borne to the rest of home or to the battles of the sea. It had known and served all the men of whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake to Sir John Franklin, knights all, titled and untitled, the great knights errant of the sea. It had borne all the ships whose names are like jewels flashing in the night of time, from the Golden Hind returning with her round flanks full of treasure to be visited by the Queen's Highness, and thus pass out of the gigantic tale, to the Erebus and Terror bound on other conquests, and that never returned. It had known the ships and the men. They had sailed from Deptford, from Greenwich, from Erith, the adventurers and the settlers, king's ships and the ships of men on change, captains, admirals, the dark interlopers of the Eastern trade, and the commissioned generals of East India fleets. Hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, they all had gone out on that stream, bearing the sword, and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth, the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires.
That was an amazing performance too.
Everyone sort of, there's one person smiling, but the rest of you had kind of straight faces.
But what's striking is that as you are forced into this schizophrenic situation of hearing the Conrad text and reading yours, it's amazing how the tighter the Conrad text seems, and the more focused on the linearities of colonialism and empire and the transit of goods. By contrast, I mean, you have this Rabelaisian appetite for raising up all the discontents that were repressed, if you will. Do you want to talk a little bit about the process of texturing this? Because it's in a literary sense, it's a feat.
So I'm rewriting the whole novel, and this is just the first 3 pages. And I realized at some point while writing that I realized while writing at some point that it's a very bodily process, and this will be incorporated into the video, that I'm looking for rhymes by making the sounds of words. So as I read Conrad's text, I'm reading aloud to myself and making the sounds of possible rhymes by going through the whole alphabet. And so there's a kind of a voiced translation, and I'm asking the viewer to do the same thing, and I realize it's actually a difficult thing to do, to be listening to one text and reading another. But then you are re-performing this sort of simultaneous translation. And I think this becomes a staging area in the way that Homi Bhabha was just talking about. So in terms of that sort of multiplicity of the voices, the excess, and certainly Bakhtin was a kind of model for me to think about the idea of the sort of carnivalesque, the sort of excess. But in Conrad's case, I'm also using the term colonialesque as a kind of celebration of the colonial, which I think is what Conrad does. And I'm interested in the lingering and lasting pleasures that allow people to read the text and still and forgive the racism that's embedded within it. So there's something about the pleasures of colonialism that I think continue, which is why we're still so invested in it. And so it's not a simple critique of Conrad, it's to investigate its pleasures.
But also through this radical act of, if you will, queering the text and opening it up to this carnivalesque, this heteroglossia, you're also pointing to a whole set of dimensions that don't normally form part of that narrative. So there's also a concern with multivocality. Also from paragraph to paragraph, those concerns shift and slip.
Yes, so actually through the trajectory of the rewriting, something else I realized that I began to do was increasingly incorporate news articles or things that I was hearing on the radio. And so it becomes a kind of almost diaristic as well. I guess that the idea of the sort of excess, certainly there's something that's very repressed in Conrad's use of excess. I mean, his first language is Polish, and so English is a learnt language for him, and he invents English as, you can see that in the way he constructs his sentences. And there's a real pleasure that he uses in this invention of a new language for him. But in that pleasure, in the excess of it, there's another repression, I think, that goes on. And it's repressed in the sense that it gets naturalized or normalized, which is also what makes the racism so palatable within the text in some ways. I think pivotal to the novel is his depiction of gender, and he sort of polarizes the white woman and the black woman, and that's where we see the sort of I guess the most acute sort of descriptions of racism. And so I also wanted to make that explicit within the text. And this notion of queering it, in some ways I'm indebted to Jean Genet. And while I'm writing this, I'm thinking that Genet is rewriting this text as if he was writing Our Lady of the Flowers. and in my early teens, I also saw a performance of Flowers by the Lindsay Kemp Company. And it was probably about 20 minutes into the performance that I realized all the characters, they're female characters, but all the actors were male. And I was young, okay, it took me a while. But so I'm thinking of this here, that even though the main character is a she, it's played by male actors or protagonists. And so in many ways the characters themselves are literally queered, but also to turn it against Conrad.
I want to turn now, Praneet, to you with these questions of what one does with a received language or a narrative or an official ideology that puts a certain kind of repression in place, and what it means for you, say, as an artist, to have now worked in Kashmir, which is a situation, as some of you are probably aware, in India, where there is a high degree of militarization and effectively an occupation, if you will. And there is, it's a very complex situation with a low-intensity military conflict, elements of militancy, and also a genuine desire for autonomy. So I want you to perhaps take us through the work you've done in Kashmir, which involves a certain assemblage of language that is broken, images that are tentative, and yet forming into a kind of creation of a world, if you will, in which these things can be spoken of, the things that could not be spoken earlier.
So I should just begin by saying I entered the valley, Srinagar, in the winter of 2010, just after what had been a particularly violent summer. And before I'd done a little bit of work, and before going there, and I had set up meetings with people and with academics as well as with people from the press, and I slowly deviated away from the constellation that they had set up to set up my own trajectory within the city. Should I play the slideshow and then we can? I think we need this.
I'm thinking that if Allan's work on Conrad worked through excess and through this kind of heteroglossia and its both its celebration and a certain critical view of it, your work in Kashmir works through lacuna, ligature, rupture, if you will, and yet there's through these speech acts and the images that refer to a reality without capturing it or wanting to capture it. There seems to be a very, very different way of looking at voicing.
I have to say, when I entered Srinagar, I realized the moment of entering the airport, I realized I was in an extremely militarized zone, more than what I had expected. So the conversations that are there, which I've collaged, were conversations. The first one was a conversation which somehow underlines the agitated ethnic nature of the trouble between, say Pandits and Muslims, and the second one was graffiti that you see throughout the city, which says "India, go back," and it's everywhere. It's not difficult to find, and I decided to give those texts a face, and to break them down and to collage them, to play with the language and use it as a narrative thread to structure the narrative of the piece. So some of the images that you see are normal everyday images that you would see moving through Srinagar, but some of them are also some of the buildings, for example. One of them is the infamous police detention center on the banks of the Jhelum. The other is the United Nations Military Observation Center. I also, when I was there, I also realized that because of the insurgency, we've forgotten about. We're not sent to some of the more important archaeological sites in the city and beyond, and they enter the narrative of the space. Islam enters North India through Kashmir, through Sufism, and we have the shrines of some of the more important Sufi saints that entered India, situated in Srinagar. Also, in fact, one of them, which is Dastagir Pir, I think burnt down recently. Some of the images that we see of the pattern, the collages of the patterns, are from this shrine. And I was let in by a very sympathetic policeman, because people were not being allowed in to take photographs, and they somehow allowed me in, and I managed to take these photographs. And this building doesn't exist anymore. So I think there's also that a little bit of there's a bit of a space for fiction, but also some of it is also a report.
I was just thinking that again, it's the kind of reality that in its capacity for grief and suffering and what this has cost. We were speaking yesterday of mobilization and counter-violence. Kashmir is, as a good Kashmiri now, I must point out that this is a region that has paid many, many times over in blood and suffering for the romantic notions of counter-violence. And that it certainly is the kind of region where urgently what is needed is both testimony that deals with experiences that exceed what can be said or shown, as well as initiatives towards some kind of mutuality or reconciliation. But I want to thank you for that, Praneet, and I want to take those thoughts, Allan, to the work you've done also with and about subjectivities that are at large in a world that somehow exceeds their grasp. And yet through indexical means, as it were, you actually play out a sense of how that world can in fact be made one's own if one is somehow kept outside it. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about
actually, I was thinking along those very lines. While looking at Praneet's piece. And so, I gave you an example where I'm working from a pre-existing text. And the piece I'll show next, I have to switch over. The piece I have to show, that I'll be showing next is a photographic series. But I also think of it as a text. I think we're on this side. And we think of a text similar to its associations with textiles, and so textiles being something that's woven as a kind of intersection of threads. Did you hear that? Okay. So the relationship between text and textile being an interweaving of threads, and a text being an interweaving of previously existing texts. And with Praneet, so I was just thinking this to myself, while watching that the pre-existing text is actually the landscape that you're observing, that you're moving through, but also the news reportage, the sort of documentation of the struggle there, the conflict there, and so with the photo series that I'm going to show. So it's pre-existing text that are already surrounding us in the environments and the spaces that we move through. So did you have a quick thought before?
Well, yeah, there's definitely that. There's this palimpsest of the media that as an artist working over there, I constantly had to renegotiate and reconfigure myself to, do I want to deal with this, or do I want to deal with something more personal? But I think it created filters and it created resistances which I had to work through. And it's a body of work that's also still emerging. So as much as it's a play with language, it's also something that's driven by time.
Time. I guess another factor. I mean, I certainly think of one of the things. If I get this to work. Okay, great. It's hard to get away from anything that I'm thinking about. Hard to get away from what Homi Bhabha was just been talking about. So, I mean, I certainly think that I use an idea of hybridized time, and certainly in the colonial context and the post-colonial context, where any imagining of a future is done through a memory of the colonial period, and so the acting in the present is also a future-making process. So, in that sense, a sort of a spectrum of time. So this is a photo series called the World series, and my slightly sort of flippant titling of it was derived from the World series, which is the American baseball competition, which consists of American teams, and yet they call themselves the World. And I thought, if America can do that, then I can use my travel photos and think of it as the World. But it's as you can see in the image, it's presented as a linear sequencing, almost as a film strip, and it's also a fiction. But within that initial presentation of the linearity, I think there's the possibility of being able to go forward, go back, different sort of circular directions, and allowing you to move in the space of the gallery allows you to also to move back and forward in time. So there are 60 images here, and I'll just give you a few examples of them. So this is, okay, that's more of the series. This is the first in the series, which sets up that question of time and temporality. So this is actually in San Francisco. The next image is a pointing back to that initial sign, and so as a gesture back of memory. And the following one sets up a kind of circular motion, and also introduces the plane as the sort of vehicle for mobility within this particular series. So the other narrative is that we're actually entering into the airport, the terminal, and onto the plane, and to a passage or a transition. This happens to be Tegel in Berlin. And so it's setting up the narrative of mobility, and at the same time the restrictions to mobility. So here's the first stop sign, with two African men, coincidentally, on the tarmac. And then onto the plane with the welcome screen. So each of those screens says welcome. And then on the plane itself, looking out, the ice crystals on the plane window, sort of mimicking a flock of birds, again as this kind of symbol of mobility. And stereotypically, the image of freedom too. One of the names for this this particular phenomenon, which you can barely see, it's a rainbow completely surrounding the shadow of the plane. And one of the names for it is the Brocken spectre from the German legend of the Brocken. And then on arrival, before you actually hit the ground, this is the first sign one sees. And so it's setting up a fictional narrative about a particular migrant. And during the course of the series, you get introduced to that migrant. Okay. So there are other sort of prohibitions against mobility. And the casting back to history. Columbus, no left turn onto Pacific. And so, we're definitely in the US here. And in the US, there's the conflation and the confusion between which kind of Indian. So this is actually a photograph of Alcatraz Island, and it's the Native American occupation of that island in the 1970s in protest. So the sign is a leftover from that protest. So when you arrive at Heathrow Airport, this is one of the first signs that you see of an Indian policeman. So in the series, the migrant is actually depicted as an Indian male. And so you arrive at this new location and you see your supposed self reflected back to you, but it's actually a self that is not quite the mirror of Dorian Gray, but it's certainly the form of authority which is there to restrict your mobility. Okay. This is in Arizona, and if you continue along that road, you will get to the inmates who are in their orange prison costumes, guarded by armed guards, and they're cleaning the roads. On a door in New Orleans after Katrina, anti-immigration demonstrations, and just point out in the corner, the taxis in San Francisco have our people, our community, and so this question of the borders and who's legal, who's illegal, also brings into question who are we talking about when we talk about our people? This is Virgin America plane, and you notice that planes are all titled, all have names. You probably can't see it in the slide, but the name of this plane is Contents Under Pressure. And what does America do when it's under pressure? Calls in an airstrike. Okay. And this is the last in this, not the last in the series, but the last of the image that I'll show you from this series. So there's it's also not only about this particular migrant, but it's the situations that he's traveling through, and it's not that he has to change his identity in order to fit in. He's rereading the signage the landscapes, the colors, the textures, the histories, etc., of the locations he's moving through. So it's not that he has to undergo a transformation. The places he moves through is being transformed by his presence. And this last image is a dead American soldier, the body being unloaded off a civilian aircraft. That's the only time I've ever seen that in a civilian airport.
It also puts us back in mind of Homi's thought earlier that on reading Kant, it is mobility and communication that serve as the grounds for thinking about a constitution of world citizenship. But in fact, those are precisely the conditions that are constrained and calibrated and regulated in this way by nation states, and that whilst we might celebrate a certain kind of mobility, the more compelling mobilities are those of military deployment and the way in which sovereignty is secured.
And I think actually going back to the talk that you gave, setting up, what does it mean to be a citizen? As a negotiation with the state where you surrender some of your rights in order for the illusion of security and protection. And it's that constant negotiation of that.
Which, the thought of that, who is a citizen, what are your rights, when are you unaccommodated, when are you secure, what guarantees that, puts me in mind very much of your ongoing series, Praneet, where you reclaim, if you will, from another part of this canonical tradition, the work of Goya. And I thought also we should talk a little bit about reclamation or reclaiming, because sometimes it's assumed that the post-colonial or the immigrant experience is something that belongs elsewhere, can be put in a box, but in fact it leaks everywhere. It's transitive, it's transitional, and it makes claims on places, things, reserves, resources far removed from wherever it's supposed to be, in a state of docility, if you will. So it's very non-docile. So could I, Praneet, invite you to talk a little bit about and to present your series, Disasters War?
A small anecdote which Allan's piece reminded me of years ago. I was entering JFK and quite jet-lagged and hauled up at immigration. And the police, the guy over there, the policeman said, "So what do you do?" And in America, everyone says "sir" at the end. What do you do, sir? So I said, "Well, I'm an artist." And he said, "What? An artist?" I said, "Yes." He said, "So what medium do you use?" And I thought it was quite surreal. I thought. So I said, "I don't quite know how to answer. I didn't quite know how to answer that question." And I said, "I'm not sure." He said, "Well, do you paint or do you draw? Or or do you sculpt?" And I said, "Well, a bit of both, I guess, all three." So the Disasters of War was a series I began just around the time I had entered the Netherlands. I had been living and studying in the US and left just after the events of 2001. And I think it was a moment where, for students like me that had been studying and living in other parts of the world, life became a bit more difficult in terms of mobility. It was very difficult to move around. Every time you asked for a visa, it was, you would get it, but then the amount of checking that was going on at the airports was extreme. So. When I was in while I was in the US, I had been studying at UC San Diego, and one of my professors was Jean-Pierre Goran, who was a part of the Ziga Vertov collective. And around this time, the specter of terrorism was just beginning to be reported around 1999, 2000. And we began looking at the images that were in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, and began to notice that a certain lens was being that parts of the world, such as Afghanistan or Pakistan, there was a particular lens that was coming, which actually became very clear after the footage that came out from September the 11th, where we see the images from Manhattan. It's been reported. I mean, it's been written on very widely. They look like images from an action movie. But then a few months later, with the attack on Afghanistan, we began to see biblical biblical landscapes in the media. And when I came to the Netherlands, I began to sift through this imagery. I began to store it, and as a way to, every time I've moved a country, I found my practice to collapse, and it's been a while to build it back up. And I began to make drawings related to some of the images that I was seeing. Now, these are not all related to 9/11, and I'm not going to show all my images, but just a few. I think we're not. Slipped off. Is that better? I don't think we can see much. But I was looking at the media images and tracing them, and drawing them very small. And let's see. Is that better? So this became over time a series of drawings related to. I was looking very very particularly at images related to terror, and I began to collect these images as drawings. They come from these particular images came from the bombing of Gaza by Israel in 2009. And these are drawings which came out much later of the debris of the World Trade Center. It's a bit difficult to. That's the facade of the tower. Just the lower part was. The upper part's burnt and the lower part not. But I was looking to see how drawing would transform these images related to the press. I've always been seduced by the miniature. We have a strong miniature tradition in India from the Mughal miniature, but also Rajasthan, and in Europe we have the Flemish primitives. It's something I've always been interested in. How you can create a world that's very small and can hold attention. And I began to work on these drawings and began to turn them into miniature paintings. I hope these show well over here. So this was the first one, which relates to. Is that too small? Is that better? So this was the first one, which was in color. It was the image of it was based on a triptych which came out in the New York Times, and it showed a Taliban soldier being captured by Northern Alliance soldiers and being pulled to the side and then executed. The images in the newspaper were in the New York Times were extremely graphic, and they stayed with me for a while. And then at a certain point, I began to see how I could reconfigure the moment and recreate that narrative, stepping away from the abject violence that we see in the media. So here you see here you see people arguing over the convict, the captured soldier, and then being led away. And of course, he was killed in the. You see him being shot to death in the press image. But I refrained from showing that. They're extremely small. They're 21.5 by 21.5 centimeters each. And I found paint that comes from a Swiss company, which is very thick and matte and somewhat like tempera. So I was trying to find ways to also create a technique which would allow me to work with these images in a personal way. Let's go to this. This is a lot. I kept the images which came down which I had collected from the burning, from the attack on the towers for a long time. Before finally finding a way to work with them as images. They're very difficult images to work with. And I always felt that if I had to work with these images, I had to find a narrative that would deviate from the discourse that we see in the press. So I came up with a miniature diptych. This is the first part, where you see three Taliban soldiers buying and selling bags of food aid that US forces had dropped on them in Afghanistan. That's the foreground. And the background is a detail from the towers which were burning, and you see a very, very small detail of people falling from it. And it's cut out in the shape of that last piece that was left standing, which became iconic and was reported hugely. And this is the second part of the diptych, where you see these Taliban soldiers sifting through the debris, and that image, of course, harks back to Bruegel's Tower of Babel, and I was just it took me 5 years to come up with this composition from the drawings, and I have to also say that I had to find a technique to make them to make the paintings look like drawings, so that took a while to develop. So that's how they look together. And at a certain point, some of the more difficult images, such as those related to, let's say, the incident of the beheading of Daniel Pearl, to find, you also realize that these images have to somehow be, had to be used, but how do you use them? And I set up in my studio a small stage where I asked myself, where I got myself or friends, myself because I was always available, and friends if they would help me, to pose for me and turn those images back to drawings, which were then distorted anamorphically. So this image over here is David. It's called David and the Goliath, and the strange figure in the foreground is it's a mathematical distortion. It's anamorphic. So you see the figure of the assassin with the head of Goliath. And a lot of the images then became, the narrative also, there was a dual, if there was one narrative that was the media, exploring images related to the media or the event itself, the other narrative was that of image construction, and how you could create a narrative also by distorting and fragmenting imagery. At times, some of the images would be reduced to symbols, such as this. So I mean, I think it's quite clear the two images of the people falling with the facade of the towers inside them. And this is an image which came out of the terrorist blast that took place in London. I think it was 2007. And this was an image that was reported very widely by the media. The name of the victim was Davinia. And Davinia Terrell, I think, and she was shown with a mask on her face, a surgical mask. I think she had splinters of glass in her face, and a very strange image. Also took me back to Greek mythology, and I asked a friend of mine again to pose in a similar way. Those images got reduced to drawings, and then different distortions to see how you could, on one level, work with that image to create to collage it. And the collage is, what the collage does is it pushes you away from the media narrative into one of image construction, and mythology and myth and translation. So it's a body of work that's still in progress. This is a work I did, which is based around the torture of the prisoners in Abu Ghraib. It's an allegory. So myself and friends posed in ways related to a lot of those images, and images which have also become a part of my personal vocabulary. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you both for insights into practice and context and choices of poetics. We'd be happy to actually for questions or observations. Do we have a mic that can go around? Ariane, do you have? Alice, did I detect a... No. No. Is there a question at the back?
Thank you both so much. I really enjoyed this. The artwork is amazing. I had a question for Allan deSouza about the first piece you did. It reminds me a lot of Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, which I wonder if that's a reference for you, but mainly I'm wondering, in that work, it's a much it's a very interesting multilingual polysemic work. And in your work, in contrast, it seems like you're, just from the small section you showed us, that you're working with the English language. And I was wondering if it's only the English language that you're working in, if that's a conscious choice against a kind of neo-colonial dominance of the English language today, you know, thinking of also of your World Series work, or have you considered using, you know, polyvalent, multilingual references?
It is predominantly in English. There are phrases, certainly there's Latin, there's Jamaican slang, there's French, predominantly. So it's actually words that would be recognized sort of more internationally, I think, sort of words and phrases. So certainly Joyce is an influence. So there are a lot of references to different writers. Salman Rushdie is another one. I mean, and also his essay about, or his descriptions about English being an Indian language, actually. So that it's a sort of invented Indian language in the way it's used. So it's a sort of broader notion of English. But I am using phrases that I come across, you know, as I mentioned in the news, but also in conversations, things that people recognize. But of course, it has to rhyme with Conrad's text, so that also. So if he uses French, then I will also use French. There's a couple of instances where he's using Latin, but then I've used English for that. I think there was another part of your question, or that was it? Okay.
For Allan, if you can say something, if you also doing other kind of products, not books, but if you deal with other text or other, that it's not required to invest so much. I mean, if you are interested also in other kind of communication with, and what is actually, what you consider like achievement, or what would you like to bring upon, like from the audience? What would you consider like achievement for you? And if you, and the other for you, maybe I saw that you have also about Gaza, so maybe you want to refer to this. It's interesting me personally.
Okay, so I think this Conrad text is a good example of how I work. I was initially imagining as a script. So it'll be performed, possibly by me, but I'm also talking to other people who will perform it. The original plan, or the way I was imagining, was that Mr. Kurtz survives. And he makes the river journey back, and he gets back to Europe. And I was going to do a trip from the source of the Rhine estuary all the way to Switzerland, and I was going to be standing on the prow of the boat reciting this text with performers around me. So that might still happen. So it is a performance. It's previously done as a live reading, so a different kind of performance. It'll be published as a book. I'm also planning photographs based on it. You know, so it'll be multiple forms. And so I do work across different media, and also cannibalize my own work. So I'll go back to another project and reconfigure it into another medium. In terms of the audience, I ask a lot from the audience, in the same way that I asked you to be able to do the simultaneous translation. But I think that's something that we all do in our daily lives anyway. We're constantly translating information and reconfiguring it in other ways. And so I kind of ask the audience to do that kind of thing with my work, but also to give it time to allow that to happen.
I didn't get your question exactly.
I saw that you have also a sketch about Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to refer to
This was when this is dating to the time when there was the attack by Israel on Gaza, and it went on for a month, if I remember correctly. But it released a lot of media images, as these attacks usually do. But those images were collected, and over time they became drawings. It was a way for me to be able to deal with these images, to also exploit, because as you're drawing it, you're also learning and reading and researching them more. And then eventually, they may or may not move into other forms of, such as the miniatures, or perhaps collages, or murals, depending on the project that I have in mind. But it's a way of making that imagery yours. It's tracing them, drawing them, and then collecting them. It's a way of entering the subject.
And that's probably going to be the last question. Okay. Aryan, maybe one last question. Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. My question addresses Praneet.
Yes.
And your series of political violence that you showed in this short iconography out of your desktop. And I would like to ask more iconologic question, which is not only about the series that you made, but of the especially two montages that you have shown when you put the World Trade Center ruin in the back and the three Taliban people in front.
Right.
I don't know if this is a montage that you have created or if you took it out of the media, because it's a really strong ideologic icon that you produced, and it reinforces stereotypes that I think an insurgent cosmopolitanism would like to get rid of and not to reinforce. So as you are, I guess, from Calcutta, you're kind of in the neighborhood
Right.
of that people. How do you get along with this stereotyping?
I actually think I was working against the stereotype when I did those. When I worked with those images, and I did those. I think I did those images in 2005. This is or 2006, quite after the event itself. I'm not sure that I was following the stereotype. I'm quite sure. In fact, I'm quite sure I wasn't. I was. They come from. They're a montage, right? Because montage involves time, and it's from 3 or 4 different images that I collected over time. Images that you don't really see juxtaposed together. And by juxtaposing together, I wanted to open up that narrative to different interpretations than what we are usually used to seeing. So if you're seeing an image of people jumping out of the towers against Afghan soldiers buying and selling bags of food aid that were dropped down by United States Air Force, I think that opens up a conversation that could be interesting. Complicities, and yes, exactly, and also
that the food parcels were also the same color as the cluster bombs.
Exactly, they were painted, which I removed because I painted the images black and white. But of course, those food bombs were painted. The food packages were painted the same color as the cluster bombs. So a lot of people got killed, thinking food was. So I think I was working against the stereotypes. I seriously don't see. I've not seen those images placed together in the same constellation.
Yep, that's exactly the point. That you're combining kind of images that are like precarious images that have a certain iconography that we know, especially from the last 10 years, let's say, and. I don't see if you have the titles, like the paratext that you would need for them, to have the story behind those images that you would need if you put them together from different contexts.
But they're not stereotypical Islamic.
No, they're not. I don't think you need a paratext. I think those images speak for themselves. And also their paintings, in a sense, so that itself, the act of painting them, creates a different lens. I actually think that in terms of semantics and in terms of image making and in terms of making symbols, that I was working against the status quo, definitely questioning a hierarchy of images. I realized also my position over there. So I thought I think I've thought that painting through for 5 years before painting it. So I definitely was not working with stereotypes. I was working against them.
Did you want to say something to that?
Well, yeah, not specifically about that, but I think, I mean, you mentioned that you're creating fictions too.
Yes, also, that's true. The point is that to make one thing I do think in the disasters of war and other images which I make is to open up images to narrative, not to close it down. So I'm not trying to make a closed-ended loop. There's no statement over there. There's no in the diptych. It's not black and white. And your eye has to move across the frame to see, to pick up the details and then piece your story together.
Yeah, I mean, I was worried. I mean, this is the first time I'm showing this text publicly, and I have a certain anxiety about presenting. I mean, certainly people will think of me very differently now after having read the text, but my sort of concern was, it uses a very sort of misogynist language. It can be seen as that. And I was thinking of a sort of conversation I'd been having with another artist about Paul McCarthy's work. And I was trying to explain my thinking about Paul McCarthy, that his source material is sort of, horror B-movies and TV sitcoms that have stereotypical depictions, usually around the family. And so his interest is in how the stereotypes get played out and sort of normalized within society, and accepting them, that they're racist, they're misogynist, they're all about this sort of supposed pure family. And in some ways that was kind of permission for me that this imagery, this language circulates. We know it, we've absorbed it. We have to recognize that we function in a misogynist, sexist, racist society, and we can't pretend we're otherwise. But so at least let's bring it out into language, let's address it. So I have a kind of anxiety about that, but also feel like, well, I need to address it still. So it's how to make those stereotypes externalized.
To go back to your use of Conrad, maybe he may have been racist, but it's still beautiful prose in its own way, and by addressing that beauty, you put together a constellation of ideas and thoughts which could lead on to something else. I think that's important also.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Allan, Praneet, and all of you. And we can take some of these thoughts with us to the final session of the day. There is another one beyond this. 10:30 in the Theatersaal is Rasha Salti, a writer, curator, and programmer for cinema. She's talking about sketches towards an alternative Arab almanac. And many of these questions that have preoccupied us will assume another form and valency in her inquiry. Thank you for being here.